Uncle Walter was 68 years old and lived alone at the end of Red Hollow Road. Everyone in town still called him Uncle Walter, even men who had long since gone gray themselves. He had no children. His wife had died more than a decade earlier. And after that, Walter rarely left the farm, except to buy engine oil, coffee, and dog food for Buck. His aging hound. Behind Walter's barn sat an old wrecker. It had once been painted a deep red, but 18 years of rain, snow, and summer heat had stripped the color into patches of rust and blackened steel. Weeds grew around the tires. A young maple had pushed its way up between the cab and the towing boom. The hood was buried under rotting leaves, and the cable on the winch had hardened into a brown coil, like a dead metal snake. Most people in town could not remember the last time the truck had moved. Walter could. It had been a November morning 18 years earlier. Snow had just begun to fall when his older brother, Henry, climbed into the cab and started the engine. Henry had not said where he was going. He had only told Walter not to wait for supper. 3 days later, the wrecker was hauled back to the farm. Henry did not return with it. After the funeral, Walter had the truck dragged behind the barn. He never repaired it. He never sold it. When a scrap dealer came by years later and offered to take it away, Walter stood in the yard, with both hands buried in the pockets of his coat. "That truck isn't going anywhere," he said. For 18 years. He never opened the cab. Then, one night, a storm rolled over Red Hollow. Rain hammered the tin roof, hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Wind forced itself through the cracks around the windows, making the oil lamp above Walter's kitchen table swing from side to side. The power flickered twice and then went out completely. Walter lit another lamp, set it beside his cold coffee, and listened to the storm. Buck suddenly lifted his head. The old dog did not bark. He simply stared toward the barn. Walter heard something. A short, sharp sound. Metal against metal. Clang. He stayed still. Branches were striking the side of the house. A loose sheet of roofing could have been moving in the wind. A chain inside the barn might have been swinging against a post. Then the sound came again. Clang. This time, Walter knew it had not come from inside the barn. It had come from behind it. He pulled on his raincoat, picked up a flashlight, and took the shotgun from the hooks near the door. He did not truly expect a thief. Nobody with sense would come up Red Hollow Road in weather like that. But a man who lived alone learned not to step into the dark empty-handed. The wind hit him the moment he opened the door. Rain drove across the yard in silver sheets. Buck moved ahead with his nose low to the ground, while Walter followed more slowly. His left knee ached in cold weather. The result of a tractor rollover almost 30 years earlier. The flashlight beam passed over the barn wall. A stack of wet pine boards, and finally the old wrecker. A heavy maple branch had broken loose and fallen behind the cab. It had not crushed the truck, but it had torn away a weathered plank Walter had nailed there years before. The plank now hung at an angle. Something beneath it was exposed. Walter stepped closer. Buck stopped several feet from the truck. The hair along the dog's back rose slightly. "It's only an old machine," Walter said. He was not sure whether he was speaking to the dog or to himself. Walter pushed the smaller branches aside. Rainwater ran down the rusted cab and collected along a narrow rectangular seam behind the driver's seat. He wiped the mud away with his sleeve. A flat steel panel appeared. It was about 2 feet wide and set into the rear wall of the cab. Walter had spent most of his life around trucks, tractors, winches, and farm machinery. He knew factory seams. He knew repair plates. He knew what rushed welding looked like. This was none of those things. The panel had been fitted carefully. Its edges were sealed with a dark rubber compound that remained strangely firm despite its age. The screws were not original to the truck. Each one had been coated with grease before being driven in. Even after 18 years, there was less rust around the panel than on the metal surrounding it. Walter leaned closer. At first, he thought the marks near the bottom were scratches. Then he realized they were letters. He cleaned the surface with his thumb. The words were faint, almost hidden beneath the corrosion. "Do not open without cause." Walter stared at them for a long time. The rain struck the back of his coat. Water ran from the brim of his hat. Somewhere in the darkness, a tree cracked under the force of the wind. He touched the panel again. Henry had owned the wrecker for nearly 20 years before his death. Walter had helped repair the brakes, replace the radiator, rebuild the winch, and patch the floor of the cab. But he had never seen this panel. He had never heard Henry mention it. Then Walter noticed a second detail. Beneath the warning was a narrow stamped line, nearly erased by rust. It was a date, the date of Henry's final trip. For the first time in 18 years, Walter reached for the handle of the wrecker's cab. The next morning, Walter stood behind the barn with a wrench in one hand and Henry's warning in his mind. In daylight, the old wrecker looked less mysterious and more exhausted. Rust had eaten through the lower doors. One rear tire had collapsed into the mud, and moss covered part of the towing boom. Walter cleared away the broken maple branch and remembered what the truck had once been. Henry had bought it used in 1979. When Red Hollow had no towing service, he answered calls at every hour, tractors buried in spring mud, pickups stranded in snow, grain trucks leaning toward ditches. Walter had ridden beside him on many of those jobs. Henry never trusted force alone. Before attaching a cable, he studied the slope, the trees, the wheels, and the ground beneath his boots. A winch doesn't know what it's pulling, Henry used to say. That's the driver's job. After Henry died, collectors and scrap dealers came asking about the truck. Walter refused them all. He told himself he kept it because it belonged to his brother. That was only partly true. On the morning of Henry's final trip, Walter had seen him load extra cable, wooden blocks, 2 pulleys, and a sealed metal case into the wrecker. "Where are you going?" Walter had asked. Henry looked toward the northern ridge. "Old County Road. That road's been abandoned for years. Somebody found it again." Those were the last words Walter heard from him. Now, 18 years later, the hidden panel carried the date of that same trip. Walter knelt beside it and examined the screws. Henry had coated each one with grease before driving it in. This had not been done in a hurry. He fitted the wrench to the first screw. It would not move. Walter returned with penetrating oil, a wire brush, and Henry's old impact driver. He cleaned each screw carefully, then struck the tool with a hammer. The first screw turned, then the second. When the last one came free, the panel shifted and released a breath of stale air smelling of machine oil and old canvas. Walter pulled it open. Inside was a narrow compartment built into the wall of the cab. A metal box wrapped in oilcloth sat at the front. Behind it were a folded hand crank, a pulley block, and hydraulic lines that did not belong to the original truck. Walter reached for the box. An envelope was tied to its handle. Across the front, in Henry's handwriting, were 3 words, "For Walter only." Walter did not open the envelope immediately. He carried the metal box into the barn and set it on the workbench beneath the south window. Morning light fell across the oilcloth, revealing dark stains where grease had soaked through over the years. Buck settled near the door. Walter turned the envelope over in his hands. Henry had written his name in block letters. The way he labeled tool drawers and fuel cans, the paper had yellowed, but the seal remained intact. Walter slid a pocket knife beneath the flap. Inside was a single folded sheet. He recognized Henry's handwriting before he read a word. "Walter, if you found this, then either the truck has been needed again, or you finally stopped being angry long enough to look." Walter lowered the letter. For 18 years, he had blamed Henry for leaving that morning without explanation. He had blamed the storm, the county, the men who found the truck, and eventually himself. He forced his eyes back to the page. The panel was built to keep water, fire, and careless hands out. The box contains the recovery notes from Red Hollow and the Northern Ridge. Do not trust the county map by itself. It shows roads. It does not show what the ground does after 3 days of rain. Walter looked toward the open barn door. Beyond the pasture, the Northern Ridge stood under a layer of low cloud. He continued reading. The hand crank is not a spare reef. It is part of the winch system. The hydraulic bypass lets the drum turn when the engine cannot. The pulley block doubles the pull but halves the speed. Use the outriggers before pulling sideways. Never anchor to a tree until you have checked the roots and the ground around them. Walter glanced at the folded mechanism inside the compartment. Henry had not hidden a treasure. He had hidden instructions. Walter opened the metal box. Inside lay a thick notebook wrapped in waxed cloth, 3 folded maps, and a bundle of small brass tags tied together with wire. Each tag carried a number. The notebook explained them. Number 12, Miller Creek Bridge. East Bank, unstable after flood. Number 19, Old Quarry Road. Stone base beneath 12 inches of clay. Number 27, White Oak above Carter Field. Safe anchor, only from west side. Walter turned page after page. There were sketches of slopes, cable angles, wheel positions, and pulley arrangements. Henry had drawn arrows showing how a truck might roll if the line was attached too high. Beside one diagram he had written, "A strong winch can still pull the wrong thing in the wrong direction." The maps were even more detailed. Red Hollow was crossed with colored pencil marks. Blue lines followed seasonal water. Red circles marked soft ground. Black squares identified barns, culverts, abandoned wells, and old stone foundations. One route ran north from Walter's farm toward the ridge. It was the same abandoned county road Henry had mentioned before his final trip. Walter spread the map flat and studied it. Near the top of the ridge was a symbol he did not recognize. A circle divided by a diagonal line. Beside it, Henry had written, "Panel route. Do not approach from the east." Walter checked the other maps. The same symbol appeared twice more. One location was near Miller Creek. The other was behind Walter's barn. He stood so quickly that the stool scraped across the floor. The sealed panel had not merely stored the maps, it was marked on them. Walter returned to the wrecker and examined the open compartment more closely. Behind the hydraulic lines, his fingers touched a narrow metal rail. Something was mounted farther inside. He pulled gently. A second tray slid from the wall of the cab. On it rested a small lever, a pressure gauge, and a steel plate engraved with 4 words, "Manual recovery drive locked." Below the plate was an empty key slot. Walter searched the compartment, the box, and the envelope. No key. Then one of the brass tags slipped from the workbench and struck the floor. It landed face down. On the back, unlike the others, was a small key soldered to the metal. The number on the front was 18. 18 years. Walter looked at Henry's map again. Tag 18 was marked on the northern ridge. For the first time, Walter understood that opening the panel had not answered Henry's secret. It had only shown him where the secret began. Walter carried tag 18 back to the wrecker. The small key soldered to its back fit the slot beneath the steel plate. He turned it. A heavy click sounded inside the cab wall. The lever beside the pressure gauge moved forward. Walter pulled it. A coupling engaged beneath the truck with a deep metallic knock. The wrecker had no battery and no fuel. Yet when Walter fitted the folded hand crank into the hidden socket and turned it, the winch drum moved. Only an inch. But it moved. He turned again. The mechanism settled into a slow, resistant rhythm as the old cable tightened across the drum. Henry had built a way to operate the winch without the engine. Walter opened the notebook. A simple drawing showed the hand crank connected to reduction gears. The system sacrificed speed for pulling force, combined with the pulley block. One man could move a load that his arms alone could never shift. Beside the drawing, Henry had written, "Speed is useless when control is gone." Walter turned the next page. 3 warnings had been underlined. Never use the manual drive with a damaged cable. Never stand inside the line of pull. Never trust old steel simply because it still moves. Walter examined the cable. Several strands had split near the hook, and rust had worked deep between the wires. Under tension, it could snap without warning. The hidden mechanism still worked. The truck did not. Not yet. Walter released the lever, removed the crank, and looked toward the northern ridge. If tag 18 marked the next panel, he would need to reach it without depending on the wrecker. He gathered Henry's map, the tag, a pribar, and a coil of rope. Then he started toward the road beneath the weeds. Walter left before sunrise. He loaded a shovel, a pribar, 2 lengths of chain, and Henry's map into his pickup. Tag 18 remained in his shirt pocket. The old wrecker stayed behind the barn, its open panel covered with a canvas sheet. The abandoned county road began beyond the north pasture. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a break between 2 rows of trees. Grass had swallowed the wheel tracks. Blackberry vines crossed the entrance, and a fallen fence post lay buried beneath leaves. Walter parked and continued on foot. Henry's map showed the road bending west before climbing the ridge. The modern county map showed no road at all. At first, Walter doubted he was following anything real. Then he noticed the trees. The trunks on both sides leaned away from the center, as if they had grown along the edges of an open space, beneath the weeds. His boot struck a hard surface. He scraped away the soil with the heel of his boot and uncovered compacted gravel. The road had not disappeared. It had only been covered. Halfway up the ridge, the ground changed. Water from the previous night's storm had collected in the low places, but one narrow strip remained firm. Henry had marked it with a black line. Walter stepped off the line to test the mud. His boot sank nearly to the ankle. He pulled it free and returned to the old roadbed. The map was not simply showing where to travel. It was showing where the ground could still carry weight after heavy rain. Walter continued upward. Near the top of the ridge, he found the divided circle symbol carved into an oak tree. The mark was faint, but unmistakable. Below it, the earth had settled into a shallow rectangle. Walter unfolded the map. Second panel below ground. He used the shovel carefully. 6 inches down. The blade struck metal. Walter cleared the soil away until a rusted steel plate appeared. It was smaller than the panel on the wrecker and fitted into a concrete frame. 4 bolts held it in place. In the center was a narrow key slot. Walter removed tag 18 from his pocket. The key fit again. When he turned it, one side of the plate lifted slightly. He inserted the pry bar and raised the panel. Cold, damp air rose from the opening. Inside was a narrow storage chamber lined with concrete. A coil of cable rested against one wall. Beside it lay 2 heavy pulley blocks, wooden cribbing, and a sealed glass jar containing matches, oilcloth, and handwritten notes. Walter lifted the jar. The first note carried Henry's name. The second contained a list of dates and vehicle descriptions. The last entry had been written 18 years earlier. County truck. Tow men. North slope collapse. Walter's hands tightened around the paper. The official story had always been that Henry drove onto the ridge alone and lost control in the storm. The wrecker had been found near the eastern slope, its front axle broken. There had been no mention of a county truck, no mention of 2 other men. Walter read the final line. Recovered both. Main road blocked. Returning by east descent. Henry had not gone to the ridge because he was careless. He had gone there to rescue someone. Walter searched the chamber again. Behind the cable coil, he found a weatherproof document tube. Inside was a second map, more detailed than the first. A red line showed Henry's route down the eastern slope. Near the bottom, the line ended at a hand-drawn cross. Walter knew that place. It was where the wrecker had been found. But 20 yards beyond it, Henry had drawn another symbol, a small square beneath the creek bank. Beside it were the words, "Final record, if I don't return." Walter sat back on his heels. The sealed panel behind the barn had led him to the ridge. The ridge had led him to the truth Henry had hidden. And the truth was not finished yet. Walter remained beside the underground chamber long after reading Henry's last entry. County truck. Tow men. North slope collapse. Recovered both. Main road blocked. Returning by east descent. The words were brief, written like every recovery note Henry had ever made. No complaint. No explanation. Only the facts needed by the next person who might have to follow the same ground. Walter searched the chamber again. Behind the coil of cable, he found a weatherproof document tube wedged between the concrete wall and a stack of wooden cribbing. He pulled it free. The cap had been sealed with grease and wrapped in oilcloth. When Walter opened it, the papers inside were dry. The first was a detailed map of the northern ridge. Henry had marked the old road in black, the seasonal drainage in blue, and the unstable eastern slope in red. Several notes had been added along the margins. Firm after rain. Clay beneath shallow gravel. Do not anchor below root line. At the bottom of the map, a red cross marked the place where the wrecker had been found. Walter unfolded the next document. It was a county recovery report. 2 highway workers had been trapped when part of the northern road collapsed beneath their truck. Henry had reached them through the abandoned western route. When the wrecker's engine stalled, he used the manual recovery drive and a 2-part pulley system to pull the county truck away from the ravine. Both men survived. Walter continued reading. The final paragraph stated that Henry Bell had entered a closed road without authorization and operated unsafe equipment against county instructions. Walter read the paragraph twice. He looked back at Henry's field notes. The official report made the rescue sound like the cause of the accident. Beneath it lay 2 handwritten statements signed by the workers Henry had saved. The first described the road beginning to sink beneath the county truck. The second stated that Henry had warned the crew not to approach from the eastern side. Their supervisor had ordered them forward anyway. When the surface failed, the rear of the truck slid toward the ravine. Henry anchored the wrecker uphill, redirected the cable through a pulley block, and pulled them back a few feet at a time. The workers had survived because Henry ignored the route the county had approved. Walter lowered the statements. For 18 years, people had said, Henry took an old truck onto a closed road and lost control in a storm. That was not what happened. Henry had reached 2 men the county could not reach. He had completed the recovery. Then the eastern road failed beneath his own truck while he was returning home. At the bottom of the tube was a folded letter. Walter recognized his name before he opened it. Walter. If you are reading this, then the truck has either been needed again, or you finally found a reason to look beyond what they wrote about me. Walter stopped. Rainwater moved through the branches above him. The swollen creek struck the bank below with a steady, heavy sound. He continued, Do not waste your life trying to force angry men to confess what they already know. The road failed before I reached it. The maps were wrong before I ignored them. Paper did not change the ground. Keep the truck if the frame is sound. Keep the notes, even if the truck is not. The machine matters because roads will fail again. Engines will stop. Maps will leave out the paths nobody considers important. Someone will still need to know where the ground can carry weight. Walter turned the page. Henry's handwriting became uneven near the bottom. I sealed these records because knowledge disappears faster than steel. A truck can sit for 20 years and still be rebuilt. What a man learns from the land is gone the moment nobody remembers to look. Walter folded the letter along its original creases. For 18 years, he had waited for proof that Henry had not been careless. Now the proof lay across his knees. It did not make him feel better. It only showed him how long he had allowed someone else's version of the story to stand. Walter placed the report, the signed statements, and Henry's letter back inside the document tube. He carried the pulley blocks and cribbing out of the chamber, then closed the steel plate above it. The equipment had not been hidden as a memorial. It had been stored where someone could use it. Walter returned to the farm before dark. He placed the county report and the workers' statements in the locked drawer beneath the workbench. Henry's letter went into his coat pocket. The maps remained on the table. Then Walter walked behind the barn. The old wrecker stood beneath its canvas cover. He pulled the cover away. For several minutes, he studied the rotten tires, the damaged cable, the frozen outrigger, and the rust along the frame. The truck did not need to become new. It needed to become dependable. Walter picked up a piece of chalk and wrote across the barn door, Câble, brakes, outriggers, fuel. He paused. Then he added one more word beneath them, road. For 18 years. Walter had kept Henry's wrecker because he could not let it go. Now he finally had a reason to bring it back. Walter began with the cable. The old one lay in the weeds behind the barn, twisted into stiff brown loops. He cut it into short sections and hauled it away piece by piece. Then he drove into town and bought a replacement rated for far more weight than the wrecker was likely to pull. Earl Mercer watched him load it. You're serious about this? Earl said. Walter closed the tailgate. I should have been serious 18 years ago. Back at the farm, Walter cleaned the winch drum, checked the gears, and installed the new cables slowly. He wore leather gloves and kept tension on each wrap, so the line would not bury itself under load. Next came the brakes. The master cylinder was ruined. 2 lines had rusted through. 1 rear drum was packed with mud and mouse nesting. Walter replaced what he could and rebuilt what he could not buy. It took 4 days. The outriggers took longer. The left one moved after heat and oil. The right remained frozen. Walter chained it to an oak post and worked the lever until the hydraulic seal finally gave way. Black water spilled from the cylinder. He replaced the seal, filled the system with fresh oil, and extended both outriggers onto thick wooden cribbing. The truck settled evenly. Only then did he touch the engine. He drained the fuel tank and found a layer of dark sludge at the bottom. The carburetor was blocked. The spark plug wires had cracked. The radiator held more rust than coolant. Walter repaired each failure, in order. He did not rush. Henry's notebook stayed open on the workbench. The margins were filled with practical warnings. Check the ground before the machine. Check the anchor before the cable. Check the cable before the load. On the 6th morning, Walter installed a battery and poured a small amount of clean fuel into the tank. Buck sat beneath the barn roof. Walter climbed into the cab. The seat split under his weight, releasing dust and the dry smell of old vinyl. Henry's gloves still rested behind the gear shift. Flattened by time, Walter placed one hand on the steering wheel. For a moment, he was no longer 68. He was standing beside Henry on a winter road, holding a flashlight. While the older man worked in the snow, Walter turned the key. The starter clicked. He tried again. The engine rotated once, then stopped. Walter climbed down, checked the connections, and found corrosion beneath the ground strap. He cleaned it with a wire brush and tightened the bolt. On the 3rd attempt, the engine turned steadily. Then it coughed. A cloud of black smoke burst from the exhaust. The wrecker shook violently. Walter kept his hand on the key. The engine caught. For the first time in 18 years, the old truck was running. The sound filled the yard uneven, harsh, but alive. Walter stepped down and watched for leaks. Fuel remained dry. Coolant held. Oil pressure climbed slowly on the gauge. Then a sharp knock came from beneath the hood. The engine stalled. Silence returned. Walter opened the hood. The fan belt had torn apart. He found part of it wrapped around the pulley. Earl had been right about one thing. Movement did not mean readiness. Walter replaced the belt that afternoon. The following day, he tested the wrecker without moving it. He anchored the cable to a dead tractor several yards away, lowered the outriggers, and placed heavy blocks behind the wheels. He engaged the manual recovery drive. The crank resisted at once. Walter leaned into it. The pulley system began to move. Slowly. The cable tightened. The tractor shifted less than an inch. Walter stopped and checked every connection. Nothing had bent. The anchor held. He cranked again. The tractor rolled forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, but under control. Walter watched the cable, the ground, and the angle of the truck. Henry's system was doing exactly what the notebook said it would do. It was trading speed for force. Then the right outrigger sank. The wooden cribbing tilted into the soft earth. The wrecker leaned several inches, and the cable jumped tight across the drum. Walter released the drive immediately. The tractor stopped. He stood beside the sunken outrigger, breathing hard. The machine had not failed. He had inspected the steel and ignored the soil beneath it. Walter retrieved Henry's map. A blue pencil line crossed the yard behind the barn. Seasonal drainage. The ground looked firm because the surface had dried, but the storm had saturated the clay below. Walter moved the truck 10 feet uphill, doubled the cribbing beneath each outrigger, and tested it again. This time, the ground held. By sunset, the wrecker had pulled the dead tractor across the yard. Walter shut down the engine and rested one hand against the rusted door. The truck was not restored. It was not safe for the ridge, but it had passed its first test. Across the northern sky, another wall of dark clouds was forming. The second storm arrived before midnight. Walter woke to rain, striking the bedroom window and thunder rolling beyond the northern ridge. By 1 in the morning, the power was gone. Between, water was crossing the lower pasture. At doi, szeptes prezeche. Someone pounded on his front door. It was Earl Mercer. His jacket was soaked through, and mud covered both legs to the knee. The Miller Creek Bridge is under water, Earl said. Feed truck tried the east road. Slid off near Carter Field. How many inside? Driver and his grandson. Cabs leaning toward the ditch. County crew? Blocked by a fallen oak. Their heavy wrecker can't get around it. Walter looked past Earl toward the darkness behind the barn. The old wrecker stood beneath its canvas cover. Earl followed his eyes. No, he said. That machine isn't ready. Walter put on his coat. It's more ready than the road. They uncovered the wrecker together. Rain streamed over the rusted hood. Walter checked the replacement cable, the outriggers, the fuel line, and the brakes. He loaded wooden cribbing. Shined. 2 pulley blocks. Henry's maps. And the hand crank. The engine started on the second attempt. Its headlights were weak, but enough to follow the fence line north. Walter did not take the county road. Instead, he turned through the upper pasture and entered the abandoned route beneath the weeds. Earl sat beside him. One hand braced against the dashboard as branches scraped both sides of the cab. You've driven this before? He asked. Not in 18 years? That isn't what I meant. Walter kept his eyes on the ground. The modern road had been built for speed. Henry's route had been chosen for weight. Walter followed the raised gravel bed between the trees, where the path dipped. He slowed and watched the water. Fast-moving water often crossed a firm surface. Still water could hide soft clay. At the first bend, Earl pointed ahead. That way's shorter. That way is lower. It looks dry. So did my yard. Walter stayed on Henry's black line. Minutes later, the headlights caught the feed truck. Its rear wheels were buried nearly to the axle. The left side of the cab leaned toward a washed-out ditch. Water cut beneath the rear tires in a narrow brown channel. The driver stood on the running board with one arm around a boy of about 12. Walter parked uphill. He did not attach the cable immediately. First, he walked the ground. The soil shifted beneath his boots near the truck. A straight pull from the road would drag the rear sideways and increase the lean toward the ditch. Henry's words came back to him. A winch doesn't know what it's pulling. That's the driver's job. Walter studied the slope, then chose a large white oak, 20 yards uphill. He checked the trunk, the exposed roots, and the soil around its base. He wrapped a tree strap low around it. Then he ran the cable through a pulley block anchored near the road, changing the line of pull so the truck would move uphill and sideways at the same time. Not enough to lift it, enough to keep it from sliding farther into the ditch. Earl watched him work. That doubles the line, he said, and slows everything down. The engine may not hold. It only has to begin the pull. Walter lowered the outriggers onto doubled cribbing. He walked to the feed truck. When the cable tightens, keep the wheels straight. He told the driver, lowest gear, no sudden throttle. The rear tires are buried. I know. What do you want me to do? Help when they begin to climb. Until then, let the cable hold you. The driver looked toward the ditch. My grandson stays in the cab? No. Earl takes him uphill. The boy climbed down, and Earl led him beyond the cable line. Walter returned to the wrecker and engaged the winch. The cable tightened. The feed truck shifted less than an inch. Then the wrecker's engine coughed. Walter looked at the oil pressure gauge. The needle dropped. He disengaged the winch just before the engine died. The storm swallowed the sound. Earl stared at him. We're done. Walter opened the sealed panel behind the cab. No, he said. Now we stop trying to pull it fast. He fitted the hand crank into the manual drive. Earl looked from the crank to the feed truck. You can't drag that thing out by hand. We're not dragging it out. Walter engaged the reduction gears. We're holding the line until the wheels can work again. He turned the crank. The first rotation took up slack. The second brought the cable tight. By the fifth, the rear of the feed truck shifted slightly uphill. Walter stopped. Boards, he called. Earl and the driver carried cribbing to the buried rear tires. Working from the uphill side, They pushed short planks beneath the exposed tread. Walter cranked again. The drum moved slowly. The cable did not pull the truck free. It prevented it from sliding backward while the boards took weight. Low gear. Walter called. Barely touch it. The driver climbed into the cab and engaged the transmission. The engine rumbled. The rear tires turned once and slipped. Walter held the tension. Stop. He checked the cable angle, the tree strap, and both outriggers. The right outrigger had settled nearly 2 inches into the mud. More cribbing, he said. Earl wedged additional boards beneath the foot, while Walter eased the load off the line. They reset the outrigger and began again. Walter turned the crank. Earl joined him. Together they worked the handle through each slow rotation. The cable tightened. The driver applied light throttle. One rear tire climbed onto the first board. The truck moved 6 inches, then stopped. Hold it there, Walter called. He and Earl rested for only a few seconds before adding another layer of cribbing behind the tires. They repeated the process. Crank. Hold. Board. Throttle. Stop. Check the ground. The rescue advanced less than a foot at a time. Walter's shoulders burned. His injured knee trembled beneath him. Earl's hand slipped twice on the wet handle, but the feed truck no longer leaned farther toward the ditch. The manual drive was not overpowering the weight. It was controlling it. After the fourth reset, both rear tires reached the edge of the buried gravel bed. Now, Walter called. The driver eased onto the throttle. The tires turned. This time they found the old road beneath the mud. The truck climbed forward while Walter and Earl kept steady tension on the cable, preventing the rear from sliding sideways. 1 foot, then 2. Then the rear axle rose clear of the rut. The feed truck settled onto firm ground. Walter released the manual drive. For several seconds, nobody spoke, only rain striking steel. The driver climbed down and pulled his grandson close. Earl looked at the open panel, the hand crank, and Henry's map spread across the seat. That old truck didn't beat the storm, he said. Walter removed his gloves. No. He looked toward the abandoned road beneath the trees. Henry did. Earl glanced at the wrecker. Walter added quietly, 18 years early. By sunrise, the story of the rescue had spread across Red Hollow. Neighbors came to Walter's barn to see the old wrecker that had reached a road the county's equipment could not. Walter ignored the attention. He cleaned the mud from the outriggers, inspected the cable, and wrote the remaining problems on the barn door. Then a white Roads and Bridges vehicle entered the yard. A man in a clean rain jacket stepped out. Walter Halle. Who's asking? Daniel Price. County Infrastructure Office. Price looked at the wrecker. We received reports that you operated recovery equipment on an unmaintained route. You received reports that 2 people made it home alive. Price opened his clipboard. The route is not approved for vehicle traffic. Walter carried Henry's map from the barn and spread it across the hood. The paper showed the buried gravel road, drainage channels, soft clay, and the safe anchor near Carter Field. Price studied it. These markings aren't surveyed. They were tested. Experience is not a substitute for engineering data. Walter opened Henry's notebook. This is data. Your office just didn't collect it. Price read the notes on gravel depth, seasonal water, tree roots, and the rescue 18 years earlier. His expression changed. Walter handed him copies of the workers' statement. Henry had warned the county that the eastern slope was unstable. When the road collapsed, he rescued 2 county workers. The official report later blamed him for using unauthorized equipment. Price lowered the pages. Who else has seen this? Not enough people. You should give me time to review the archive. You had 18 years. Price looked toward the old Ridge Road. What do you want? The northern route reopened for emergency access. The drainage marked correctly, and the ridge inspected before another crew is sent across it. That requires approval, funding, and liability review. It requires someone willing to look beneath the weeds. Price closed his clipboard. I'll contact you. After he left, Walter returned to the workbench. One of Henry's maps was missing. He searched the barn, the cab, and the floor. Then he noticed fresh tire tracks near the side door. They did not match Price's vehicle. Walter opened the hidden compartment. The notebook was still there. The metal box was still there. But one brass tag was gone. Number 27. Walter found the matching entry in Henry's notes. White Oak, above Carter Field. Below it was a second warning. Survey marker buried below route line. Do not let county remove it. Walter looked toward the northern ridge. The rescue had proved Henry's road still worked. Now someone was trying to erase why it had been hidden. Walter did not call the sheriff. Not yet. A missing map could be dismissed as carelessness. A missing brass tag could be called worthless scrap. Without proof of who had entered the barn, an accusation would only warn the thief. He closed the side door and examined the tire marks. The tread was narrow and deep, with a broken outer rib on the left track. A small vehicle, possibly an older utility truck. The marks led across the wet yard, then disappeared onto the county road. Earl arrived an hour later. Walter showed him the empty place where tag 27 had been. "You sure it didn't fall?" Earl asked. "Someone took the map too." Earl studied the tire tracks. Price? His vehicle was parked out front. Could have had somebody with him. He came alone. Walter opened Henry's notebook to the entry for Carter Field. The White Oak stood on the slope where they had anchored the cable during the rescue. Henry had marked it as safe, only from the west side. Beneath the route line, according to the smaller note, lay an old survey marker. Earl read it twice. What kind of marker? Henry didn't say. Property line? Maybe. Then why would the county care? Walter looked toward the ridge. Because their road may not be where they said it was. They drove to Carter Field in Earl's pickup. The storm had passed, but water still ran through the ditches. At the edge of the field, Walter saw fresh tracks turning toward the White Oak. Same narrow tread. Some a broken outer rib. Someone had reached the tree before them. The ground around the west roots had been disturbed. Mud lay in dark piles, and several smaller roots had been cut cleanly with a saw. Walter knelt beside the hole. It was empty. Earl stared down at it. They found the marker. Walter pushed his fingers into the loose soil. Near the bottom, he touched a narrow groove where something cylindrical had rested. A metal rod, perhaps 2 inches thick. He searched the dirt scattered around the roots. A fragment of yellow paint clung to one stone. Earl picked it up. Survey paint. Walter stood. Henry's route had followed the old county road across the ridge. If the marker showed that the road had been built outside the approved right-of-way or across unstable ground, the county did not own the original rescue report, would be more than embarrassing. It could prove officials had moved the recorded boundary after the collapse. Earl walked around the oak. Why hide the tag in the truck? Because it marked the location. No. Why hide it for 18 years instead of taking the marker himself? Walter considered the question. Henry had known the road, the drainage, and the landowners. He would have understood what the marker meant, but he had also known that removing it would destroy the evidence. He left it where it was. Walter said. He protected the location instead. A branch snapped uphill. Both men turned. A gray utility truck stood between the trees. Its engine started. "Hey!" Earl shouted. The vehicle reversed onto the old road and accelerated north. Walter caught only part of the license plate before it vanished behind the brush. The left rear tire had a broken outer rib. They returned to Earl's pickup and followed. The utility truck was faster, but Walter knew where the abandoned road went. At the first fork, Earl began turning east. "Stay west," Walter said. "That truck went right. That branch loops back into the drainage." "How do you know?" Henry marked it. Earl took the western route. Several minutes later, they reached a narrow crossing above Miller Creek. The gray truck appeared below them. Struggling through mud where the eastern branch had softened, its rear wheels spun. The driver abandoned it and ran toward the trees, carrying a long canvas bag. Walter and Earl continued on foot. The man moved quickly, but the wet slope slowed him. He slipped near the creek and dropped the bag. A yellow-painted iron rod rolled out. The survey marker. The man grabbed for it. Walter reached him first. He planted one boot on the rod. The stranger stopped. He was close to Walter's age, with a thin face and mud on one sleeve. Walter recognized him after several seconds. Calvin Rusk. For years, Rusk had worked as a field assistant for the county survey office. He had retired shortly after Henry's death. Rusk looked down at Walter's boot. You don't understand what that is. Then explain it. It's an obsolete marker. Obsolete things don't usually make men run. Earl picked up the canvas bag. Inside were tag 27, Henry's missing map, a short-handled shovel, and a county survey ledger sealed in plastic. Walter removed the ledger. Its pages listed measurements from the northern ridge. Several entries had been crossed out. New distances had been written beside them in different ink. The corrections moved the county road nearly 40 feet east, directly onto the unstable slope where Henry's axle had fallen through. Walter looked at Rusk. You changed the line. Rusk's face tightened. I followed orders. Whose? The road superintendent, the county attorney, everybody who understood what would happen if the original survey stayed on record. What would happen? Rusk looked toward the creek. They'd have to admit the road was built outside the approved corridor. The eastern slope was never cleared for heavy traffic. The warning was in the soil report before construction began. Earl's voice hardened, and they sent 2 workers onto it anyway. Rusk nodded once. After the collapse, they needed the road to appear legal. Henry's rescue notes were the only field record that contradicted the revised survey. So you stole the map. I wanted the marker before Price found it. Walter studied him. You knew Daniel Price was coming? He requested the old archive this morning. Once he opened the original file, he would see the numbers didn't match. Rusk tried to pull the rod from beneath Walter's boot. Walter did not move. For 18 years, Walter said, my brother was blamed for driving unsafe equipment onto a closed road. Rusk looked away. He was supposed to sign the county statement. What statement? One saying the truck's weight caused the collapse. Walter felt something cold settle inside him. Henry had not merely refused to stay quiet. He had refused to accept blame for a failure the county had created. What happened after he refused? Walter asked. Rusk said nothing. Walter stepped closer. What happened? Rusk's eyes shifted toward the ridge. They removed his wrecker from the recovery site before the state inspector arrived. Walter remembered the broken axle. The truck had been found near the eastern slope, but no one could explain how it had moved after Henry disappeared. Who moved it? Rusk swallowed. The same men who changed the survey. And Henry? Rusk's silence lasted too long. Earl stopped breathing beside him. Walter's voice dropped. Was my brother still alive when they found him? Rusk closed his eyes. Yes. The creek continued rushing below them. Walter looked at the yellow survey rod in the mud. For 18 years, he had believed Henry died alone after the rescue. Now he knew county men had reached him before the storm was over, and whatever happened next had never been written into any report. Walter stood over Calvin Rusk, while the creek pushed brown water through the stones below. You said they found Henry alive. Rusk nodded. Then tell me the rest. For several seconds, the retired surveyor seemed to study the ground as if there might be another route out. There wasn't. Earl held the canvas bag. Walter still had one boot on the stolen marker. Rusk finally spoke. Henry was pinned beside the wrecker. The front axle had dropped through the roadbed, and the cab had twisted against the bank. His leg was trapped beneath the door. Who reached him? Superintendent Voss. County Attorney Bell. 2 road workers. Me. Walter knew the names. Voss had died years ago. Bell had retired to another state. One of the road workers had moved away. The other had never spoken publicly about the ridge. What did Henry say? Walter asked. He said the ground had failed exactly where he warned it would. He told us to leave the truck where it was until the state inspector arrived. Rusk's voice weakened. Voss said there would be no inspection. Earl shifted beside him. What did they do? They brought a county grader from the west road. Used it to pull the wrecker back onto firmer ground. That's how the truck moved. Walter said. Rusk nodded. They wanted the collapse point covered before daylight. The grader pushed gravel and broken stone into the hole. And Henry? We lifted the door enough to free him. Walter's chest tightened. Was he badly hurt? His leg was broken. Maybe ribs too. But he was conscious. Then why didn't he reach the hospital? Rusk looked toward the gray utility truck. Because Voss wouldn't call it in. The words were nearly lost beneath the creek. Walter stepped closer. He left my brother on that ridge? No. Henry tried to walk. With a broken leg? He had a splint. One of the workers made it from cribbing in the wrecker. Henry said he could reach the Miller cabin by the Western Trail. Why didn't one of you go with him? Rusksiev tremblet. Because we were ordered to move the truck and alter the site? Earl stared at him. And you listened? Rusk did not defend himself. Walter remembered the official search. Volunteers had covered the eastern slope because that was where the wrecker had been found. Helicopters had flown above the creek. Dogs had followed weak scent trails through the rain. Nobody had searched the Western Trail until days later. By then, the storm had erased almost everything. You sent the search in the wrong direction. Walter said, Voss did. You knew. Yes. The answer came without excuse. Walter felt anger rising. But beneath it was something worse. A possibility. Was Henry ever found on the Western Trail? No. Did you search it yourself? Rusk shook his head. Not then. Walter studied him. Not then? Rusk looked at the canvas bag in Earl's hand. 3 years later, I went back. The creak seemed to grow louder. What did you find? A shelter. Walter said nothing. Old logging structure. Rusk continued. Half collapsed. About 2 miles beyond the county search boundary, there were signs someone had stayed there. Burned wood, food tins, a blood-stained piece of canvas. Henry's? I don't know. You knew his truck, his maps, his equipment. Did you recognize anything? Rusk hesitated. There was a pulley hook hanging from one wall. Same type he carried. Walter's hands curled. And you reported this? No. Earl swore under his breath. Rusk looked at Walter directly for the first time. I was afraid. My brother was missing. Voss still controlled the department. Bell handled every county claim. They had already changed the survey and threatened the workers. So you buried the marker? No. Henry did. Walter frowned. Rusk pointed toward the yellow rod. The marker was already below the oak roots when we returned after the rescue. Henry must have moved it earlier. Before the collapse. He knew somebody might alter the line. The brass tag had not identified a marker Henry happened to discover. It marked evidence he had deliberately protected. Walter removed his boot from the rod. Where is the shelter? Rusk looked north. The trail has mostly disappeared. I have Henry's maps. Not that map. Walter went still. Rusk nodded toward the stolen sheet. There are 3 panel locations marked there. But the divided circle means more than a sealed compartment. It means a transfer point. For what? Maps. Equipment. Message. Walter remembered the same symbol behind the barn. On the ridge. And near the creek. A network. Henry had built a chain of protected caches along recovery routes. Rusk continued. The western shelter was another point. Number 31. Walter opened Henry's notebook and searched the numbered entries. The list jumped from 29 to 32. Page edges near the binding showed where a sheet had been removed. Where is tag 31? He asked. I never found it. Walter thought of Henry's gloves behind the gear shift. The sealed panel, the second tray, and the compartments he had inspected only from the outside. The wrecker still held places he had not opened. A low engine sound reached them from above the creek. A county vehicle appeared on the Western Trail. Daniel Price stepped out. Followed by a sheriff's deputy, Rusk's face drained of color. Price approached slowly, taking in the abandoned utility truck, the canvas bag, and the yellow survey marker. I found the original ridge file, he said. Walter watched him carefully. And the measurements matched that marker. The road was moved on paper after the collapse. Price looked at Rusk. The archive also contains a dispatch log. A medical call was started that night, then canceled by Superintendent Voss. Walter felt the old rage return. Canceled while Henry was alive. Price nodded. The deputy took the survey ledger from Earl and began placing its contents into evidence bags. Rusk did not resist when he was told to turn around. Before the deputy led him away, Walter stopped him. Number 31, he said. Tell me exactly where the shelter was. Rusk gave him directions. North along the old ridge road. West at the split cedar. Down through a stone cut. Then follow the dry creek until the ground rose beneath 3 hemlocks. Was there anything else inside? Walter asked. Rusk stared at him. One thing. What? A message carved into the wall. Walter waited. Rusk's voice fell to a whisper. It said, Walter will know which road holds. That evening, Walter returned to the barn. He sat in the wrecker's cab and examined every surface Henry might have touched. The dashboard, the floor, the seat frame, the gloves behind the gear shift, inside the left glove. His fingers found something hard sewn into the lining. He cut the thread with his pocket knife. A brass tag fell into his palm. Number 31. On its back was a tiny key. Walter looked through the windshield toward the northern ridge. For 18 years, everyone had searched for the place where Henry died. No one had considered that Henry might have reached the place he intended to survive. Walter left at first light. He did not take Earl. He did not take Daniel Price. The old wrecker carried only what Henry's notebook required: fresh cable, 2 pulley blocks, chains, cribbing, a shovel, a lantern, and te inoctodiu. The engine ran rough on the climb, but it ran. Walter followed the abandoned route past Carter Field, then continued north beyond every place marked on the county map. At the Split Cedar, he turned west. The road narrowed into 2 faint ruts beneath the trees. Rain from the previous storm still moved through the low ground. But Henry's notes showed where the gravel base remained beneath the moss. Walter stayed on the raised side of the trail, stopping whenever the earth changed color. Dark soil meant water. Pale stone meant support. At the stone cut, the wrecker could go no farther. A fallen hemlock blocked the route, its roots torn from the slope. Walter parked, lowered the outriggers, and studied the tree. He could have left the truck and continued on foot. Instead, he opened the rear panel. The manual crank fitted into place with the same heavy click. Walter ran the cable through a pulley anchored to a rock outcrop, then back to the fallen trunk. The angle would pull the tree sideways rather than drag it directly toward the truck. He checked the roots. He checked the cable. He checked the ground beneath the outriggers. Then he began turning. The trunk moved slowly. Bark tore against stone. Mud folded beneath the branches. The wrecker shifted once, then settled into the cribbing. Walter stopped, reset the line, and continued. An hour later, the road was open. Beyond the stone cut, the trail descended toward a dry creek bed. Walter drove only a few hundred yards before the left front tire dropped into a hidden washout. The truck leaned hard enough to throw him against the door. He shut off the engine. The wheel hung partly over empty ground. Walter climbed down and examined the damage. Water had carved beneath the road surface, leaving a thin crust of soil above a hollow channel. The surface had lied. Henry's map had not. A blue dashed line crossed this exact section, undercut after spring rain. Walter placed cribbing beneath the frame, anchored the cable uphill, and used the manual drive to pull the wrecker backward 1 inch at a time. The process took nearly 2 hours. By the time the tire reached solid ground, Walter's hands were bleeding through his gloves. He rested beside the cab and read the sentence Henry had written near the bottom of the map. The safest road is not the one that looks easiest. It is the one that tells you what it has already survived. Walter continued on foot. The dry creek led north between steep banks. 3 hemlocks stood where the ground began to rise. Behind them, almost hidden beneath fern and fallen limbs, was the logging shelter. The roof had collapsed on one side. Moss covered the lower logs. The doorway leaned inward, held in place by a rusted hinge. Walter stopped several yards away. For 18 years, he had imagined Henry's final moments in 100 different places. A ditch, a ravine, a flooded creek. Never here. He removed tag 31 from his pocket. There was no visible lock on the door, but a narrow steel plate had been fixed beneath the lowest hinge. Walter cleared away the moss and found the key slot. The key turned. A section of the floor released near the back wall. Walter lifted it. Below was a shallow compartment lined with oilcloth. Inside lay a lantern, an empty medicine bottle, a pocket knife, and a canvas-bound journal. The pocket knife belonged to Henry. Walter recognized the notch in the handle where it had once been caught beneath a plow chain. He sat on the floor before opening the journal. The first pages contained dates. Henry had reached the shelter the morning after the collapse. His leg was broken. 2 ribs, possibly 3. He had enough food for 4 days, and water from a spring above the creek. He wrote that he expected the county search to find him quickly. On the third day, he heard an aircraft east of the ridge. On the fifth, he heard trucks on the old road. None came west. Henry understood then that the search was following the moved wrecker. Walter turned the page. The entries became shorter. Lexvelling. Fever at night. Sietsnore. No luck. Rain stopped. Creek falling. He had tried to leave twice. Both times, the slope defeated him. Then Walter reached the final pages. Henry had written more carefully there, as if he knew the words might have to carry what his body could not. Walter, you will think I left without trusting you. Truth is, I trusted you more than anyone. That is why I did not tell you before I went. Walter closed his eyes. The shelter was silent except for water dripping through the broken roof. He continued. The county wanted my signature because they needed the road failure to belong to the truck. I refused. I moved the original marker beneath the Carter oak and copied the survey before the ledger could be changed. The panels hold what one place alone could not protect. A map can be burned. A notebook can be stolen. A truck can be moved. But pieces hidden along the land are harder to erase. Walter turned the page. Henry described the manual recovery system. It had not been built merely for dead engines. It was built for places where controlled movement mattered more than power-steep slopes. Flooded roads, unstable banks, and soft ground where a large machine could destroy the surface it needed to stand on. The wrecker was not only a tow truck, it was a low-speed recovery platform designed around the limits of rural roads. Henry had studied where the valley held weight: tree roots, old gravel bits, stone shelves, seasonal drainage, abandoned logging cuts. The county measured distance. Henry measured survival. Walter reached the final entry. The handwriting sloped downward. If I do not make the West Road, do not let them turn this into a story about one bad truck and one stubborn man. The road failed because men trusted a corrected line more than the ground beneath it. Keep the records if they are needed. Keep the truck if it can still work. But do not keep my anger. That part has already cost enough. Below the final sentence, Henry had drawn a small divided circle. Under it were 4 words: the road beneath the road. Walter looked around the shelter. He understood. Every official road in the valley had another road beneath it. Not always gravel. Sometimes memory. Sometimes drainage. Sometimes the paths animals chose during floods. Sometimes the old routes farmers used before planters straightened them. The hidden road was the pattern of the land itself. Henry had spent his life reading it. Walter closed the journal and placed both hands over the cover. He had found the final record. He had also found Henry, not alive, not waiting, but no longer missing, near the rear wall, beneath the carved message Rusk had described. Walter found a second inscription. The letters were shallow and uneven. I made it this far. For years, Walter had imagined Henry's death as a failure, a broken truck, a wrong turn, a storm stronger than the man inside it. Now he saw the truth. Henry had crossed the ridge injured, protected the evidence, reached shelter, and left behind enough knowledge to save people 18 years later. The county had moved his truck. It had changed the map. It had redirected the search. But it had not erased the road Henry understood. Walter carried the journal back to the wrecker. At the washout, he rebuilt the edge with stone and cribbing before driving across. At the fallen hemlock, he stopped to inspect the anchor marks. At Carter Field, he placed tag 31 beside tag 27 inches. The metal box. Daniel, Price, and Earl were waiting behind the barn when he returned. Walter handed Daniel the journal. "Make copies," he said. "Then give it back." Daniel held it carefully. "The state will reopen the investigation." Walter looked at the old wrecker. "That may clear Henry's name." "It will." "No," Walter said. "Paper can only correct paper." He touched the rusted door. "What clears his name is what still works." In the months that followed, the county reopened the northern emergency route. Engineers confirmed the old gravel base remained stable along much of Henry's alignment. The eastern slope was closed permanently. The original survey marker was restored. The revised ledger became evidence. A small plaque was proposed for the ridge. Walter refused the first version. It described Henry as a victim of the storm. He made them change it. The final plaque read, Henry Halle, recovery driver. He read the land before he trusted the road. Walter kept rebuilding the wrecker. He replaced the tires, strengthened the bed, and installed a safer guard around the manual drive. He copied Henry's maps, but continued adding new marks in his own hand. A spring seep near Miller Creek, a soft shoulder beyond Carter Field, a maple with shallow roots, a stone shelf beneath the north pasture. The truck never became beautiful. The red paint remained faded. The cab still rattled. Rust scars covered the doors. But every winter, every flood season, and every time a machine slid where a map said the ground was safe, someone came to Walter's barn. He would open the sealed panel, choose the right tag, study the road beneath the road. Then the wrecker that had sat behind the barn for 18 years would start again, not because the old machine had been waiting to reveal a secret, because Henry had hidden something more valuable than money inside it. A way of seeing what everyone else had stopped looking for.